My name is Katelyn Marsh, and I am 31 years old. I know that detail doesn't matter much to you right now, but it matters to me, because for a long time I let people treat me like I was a lot younger than that. Like I was still the kid who needed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. It was a Saturday in January, which in Wisconsin means the kind of cold that feels personal. The kind that gets into your joints and makes you slow. I had been feeling off since the night before, a strange pressure behind my right eye, a stiffness in my neck that I kept rolling out, assuming I had slept wrong or sat too long at my desk. I work remotely as a technical writer, so I spend a lot of hours hunched over a laptop, and I had been blaming that posture for weeks. I took some ibuprofen. I drank water. I told myself it was nothing. By 6 in the morning on Saturday, it was not nothing. I woke up and the room was tilting. Not like dizziness from standing too fast. This was different. The ceiling was moving. My vision had a strange shimmering quality along the left side, like someone had smeared Vaseline across a quarter of my field of sight. I sat up and immediately felt a wave of nausea so intense I barely made it to the bathroom in time. I was sweating despite the cold, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, the left side of my face looked different. Not dramatically, not like something out of a movie. Just slightly off. The left corner of my mouth was sitting a little lower than the right. My left eye wasn't quite tracking the same as the other one. I stood at that bathroom sink for a long moment, trying to tell myself I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. I called my mom. It was 6:15 in the morning. I told her something was wrong with my vision, and my face felt strange and I was scared. She picked up on the second ring, which I remember being relieved about, and I talked fast because I was scared, and the words were coming out a little slurred, and I wasn't sure if that was fear or something else. She listened to me, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Katelyn, it's barely 6 in the morning. You're probably just dehydrated. Drink some Gatorade and lie back down." I said, "Mom, the left side of my face is drooping." She said, "Are you sure you're not still half asleep?" I called my dad on the other line. He let it go to voicemail. I called back, voicemail again. I texted him. I went back to the bathroom and took a video of my own face with my phone. I sent it to both of them. My mom texted back 7 minutes later. She said, "Katie, you always catastrophize. I'm sure it's fine. We have the Hendersons coming for brunch at 10. I stared at that text for a long time. I called my mom back twice more after that. She didn't pick up. I called my dad's phone 3 more times. Nothing. I sat down on my bathroom floor with my back against the cold tile of the tub because standing felt like too much, and I tried to think clearly, which was hard because the pressure behind my eye had moved into the back of my skull, and my thoughts kept sliding sideways like they weren't fully connecting. I know now what I did not know then. I know now that the slurred speech, the visual disturbance, the facial drooping, the confusion, those are the exact warning signs that every emergency awareness campaign talks about. FAST, face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, time to call 911. Here is why I didn't call 911 first, and I want to say this clearly because I have read the comments on similar stories, and I know it's the first question people ask. I called my parents because I wasn't completely certain something was wrong. I was scared enough to call someone, but I wasn't certain enough yet to call an ambulance and have paramedics show up at my door for what might turn out to be a tension headache and some anxiety. I know that sounds backwards, I know, but there is something about reaching for a parent in that moment that isn't about logic. It's about being frightened and wanting the person who is supposed to be in your corner to tell you what to do next. My mother told me to drink Gatorade. I called my best friend Becca, who I had known since the 7th grade and who lived 20 minutes away. She picked up on the first ring. I said, "I think something is wrong with my face." She said, "I'm getting in my car right now." I said, "Wait, I need to describe it," and she said, "No, you don't. I'm coming." I heard her keys jingling before she even hung up. Becca got to my apartment in 17 minutes. I had unlocked the door for her before she arrived because I wasn't sure I could navigate the deadbolt a second time. My hands weren't working right. She took one look at me and called 911 immediately, calmly, and with complete authority, the way some people just have the ability to do in a crisis. She told the dispatcher exactly what she was seeing. She stayed on the phone with them until the ambulance arrived, which took 8 minutes. The paramedics were in my apartment for less than 3 minutes before they were moving me out the door. I remember one of them, a young woman with her hair pulled back tight, leaning over me and saying, "Katelyn, you did the right thing calling. We're going to take care of you." I hadn't called, technically. Becca had. But I appreciated the sentiment more than I can explain. I was having a stroke. I was 31 years old and I was having an ischemic stroke. The clot was blocking blood flow in my right middle cerebral artery. The doctors told me later that I got to the hospital within the treatment window, that they were able to administer a clot-busting medication, and that the outcome could have looked very, very different if I had lain back down and trusted my mother's assessment of my dehydration. For a window of about 6 hours after they got me stable, the medical team was not certain what my long-term deficits would look like. There was a real possibility of lasting weakness on my left side. There was a real possibility of speech impairment. They didn't say permanent, but they didn't say temporary either. They used words like monitoring and wait and see and encouraging but cautious. And in those spaces between words, I did a lot of quiet reckoning about what my life might look like going forward. Becca sat with me the entire time. She sat in that uncomfortable hospital chair with her coat still on for the first hour because she didn't want to get comfortable until she knew I was stable. She got me ice chips when my throat was dry. She asked the nurses questions I didn't have the language for yet. She contacted my employer for me. She called my landlord because I had left my stove on in the chaos of the morning, and she needed to get back in to turn it off. She handled approximately 16 different logistical things while also holding my hand when I cried, which was often. She had known me for 19 years, and she acted like there was nowhere else on earth she was supposed to be. My parents arrived at the hospital at 2:47 in the afternoon, 8 hours after my first call to my mother. The brunch with the Hendersons had, I gathered, ended at some natural stopping point that allowed them to make the drive without too much inconvenience. My mother came in and her first words were, "Oh, sweetheart, you gave us such a scare." I had given them such a scare. She hugged me. My dad patted my arm. He looked uncomfortable in the way that men who don't deal well with medical situations look uncomfortable. Not cruel, just somewhere else. My mother looked around the room, clocked Becca sitting in the corner, and said, "Oh, Becca, thank goodness you were nearby," as if Becca's presence were a lucky coincidence and not the reason I was currently alive and coherent. Becca smiled at her in the polite way that Becca smiles at people when she is actually furious. My mother sat down and started talking about traffic on the interstate and how they had almost stopped for lunch but decided to push through. She said the Shissons had asked about me, which I was not sure how to interpret, because she had apparently told them enough to generate concern, but not enough to make her leave early. She mentioned that the hospital parking situation was very confusing. She mentioned that my dad had driven because she doesn't like driving when she's upset. At no point in the first 45 minutes did she ask me what the doctors had said. Not once. My dad asked one question, whether I was on blood thinners now. I said yes, among other things. He nodded, like this was an inventory rather than a conversation. There was a quiet knock at the door. A man leaned in. He was somewhere in his early 60s, gray at the temples, wearing a brown canvas jacket and carrying a paper coffee cup in each hand. He had the look of someone who had been at the hospital for a while. Not distressed, exactly, but settled into the waiting. He looked at me first, then at Becca, then at my parents, and he seemed to understand the room in the way that some people can. He said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to check in." My mother looked at him with a politely confused expression. My dad looked at him with a slightly less polite expression. Becca looked at him and then looked at me, and I realized I didn't know who he was either. I said, "I'm sorry, have we met?" He said his name was Arthur Bellamy. He said his wife was a patient on the 4th floor, recovering from a cardiac procedure, and he had been at the hospital since early that morning. He said he had been in the waiting area near the emergency department when they brought me in, and he had overheard some of the conversation between Becca and the intake nurses because it is a smaller regional hospital, and the walls are not especially thick. He said he had been in the waiting room for several hours after that, and he noticed that no family came. He noticed that only one person came in and out of my room all day, and that she looked very young and like she was doing the work of 5 people, and he thought about his own daughter, who lived across the country, and something shifted in him that he couldn't fully articulate. He said he had spoken to the patient advocate on my floor. He said he had learned, gently and without anyone violating anything they shouldn't, that there was a gap in my insurance coverage that was creating a complication with some of the follow-up diagnostic imaging I needed. A more detailed MRI series to map exactly what had happened and guide the next steps of my treatment. He said the advocate had mentioned that delays in this kind of imaging after a stroke can affect recovery planning. He asked if there was a way to help, and he paid for it. A stranger in a brown canvas jacket, whose wife was on the fourth floor recovering from her own health crisis, had paid for my follow-up MRI because he didn't want a delay to affect my recovery. I did not know what to say. I don't think any amount of articulate preparation would have equipped me for that moment. I felt Becca's hand find mine under the blanket and squeeze, and I was grateful for that anchor, because otherwise I think I would have come apart entirely. My mother looked at Arthur with the expression she uses when she doesn't understand a social situation and is buying time. Then she looked at me. Then she said, "Well, that's very generous." The same tone she uses when someone brings an unexpectedly nice bottle of wine to a dinner party. Politely appreciative, faintly baffled by the effort. My dad shook Arthur's hand and said something about that not being necessary. Arthur looked at my dad for a moment, and it was a gentle look, not accusatory but steady. He said, "I hope your daughter has a smooth recovery." And then he said he needed to get back upstairs to his wife. He touched the door frame on his way out, a small gesture, like punctuation. The room was very quiet after he left. My mother broke it first. She said, "Do you know him from somewhere?" I said no. She said, "That's a lot of money to spend on a stranger." Then she picked up her phone and began checking something on it, and that was the end of the conversation about Arthur Bellamy. My parents stayed for another hour and 20 minutes. My mom mentioned twice that the drive back would be bad if they waited too long. She said my sister had called and sent her love, which I appreciated, even secondhand. She straightened the blanket on my bed in a way that was meant to feel like care and mostly felt like motion. When they left, my dad said, "Feel better, kiddo," and touched my shoulder. My mom said, "Call us when you're discharged so we know you got home safe." So they would know I got home safe. Becca waited until I heard the elevator doors close at the end of the hall. Then she looked at me without saying anything, because she has known me long enough to know when I need a moment before I can accept words. I needed about 3 of those moments. The thing that broke me wasn't the stroke or the fear or the imaging or the terrifying wait-and-see window of those early hours. The thing that undid me quietly and completely was the mental image of my mother receiving 17 attempts to reach her. Calls, texts, a video of my own face, on a Saturday morning, and deciding that the Hendersons were coming for brunch. She hadn't heard the calls, she said later. Her phone was in the kitchen and she was in the shower. She said this like it explained everything, and I think to her it did. I spent 11 days in the hospital total, between the acute care and the early rehabilitation assessment. The neurologist was pleased with my progress. My speech had never significantly impaired, and the weakness on my left side was present but mild, and responding well to therapy. The imaging that Arthur paid for gave the team a clear picture of exactly where the clot had formed and helped them make targeted decisions about my anticoagulation protocol that my neurologist said made a meaningful difference. Those are not my words. Made a meaningful difference, that is what she said. The decision about my parents came together slowly and then all at once, the way most real decisions actually work. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't a confrontation in a hospital parking lot. It was more like I was lying in that hospital bed on the 8th night, staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles, and I just understood something that I had been circling for years without landing on. The people who show up for you when it costs them something. Time, sleep, money, comfort. Those are your people. The people who manage to arrive after the crisis has resolved and the parking is inconvenient, those are something else. And I was done pretending those two categories were the same thing. Arthur came back the next day. He brought a small plant, a succulent in a terracotta pot, because he said flowers die and he figured a plant was more optimistic. He stayed for 20 minutes, asked how I was actually doing, listened to the actual answer, and told me a little about his wife Meredith, who was doing well and would be discharged on Thursday. He had a daughter my age, he mentioned again, and she had gone through something difficult a few years back, and he hadn't been close enough to help. I got the sense that being in a hospital and seeing someone alone had activated something in him that he'd been carrying for a while. He didn't make it sentimental. He was practical and warm in equal measure, which is its own kind of rare. He told me that the patient advocate had confirmed everything was sorted and that I shouldn't worry about any of it. I told him I didn't have words. He said I didn't need any. He shook my hand when he left, old-fashioned and sincere, and he said, "Take care of yourself, Katelyn. You clearly have good people around you." He meant Becca. He had seen what Becca did. I found out 2 days after I was discharged, through a phone call from the hospital's patient rights office, that Arthur had also filed a formal account with them describing what he had observed in the waiting room. Specifically, that he had witnessed nursing staff make multiple documented attempts to reach a patient's emergency contacts during a critical window, and that those contacts had not responded or arrived in a timely manner. He had submitted this in writing. He hadn't mentioned it to me at all. He hadn't told me he was going to do it. He just did it quietly, because he thought it should be on record. I think about that a lot. The people who don't need you to know they did the right thing. I am doing well now. The recovery has been longer than I expected and shorter than I feared. I am back to work, slowly. I walk every morning, which the physical therapist said was the most important thing I could do, and I have found a genuine quiet in those early hours that I did not have before all of this. I see a neurologist regularly. I take my medication. I have made peace with the fact that my body can surprise me in ways I can't predict, and I have made less peace with other things, and I am working on the distinction. My relationship with my parents is something I am still figuring out, and I will be honest. I don't know what it looks like yet on the other side. I know what it looked like before, and I know that the fog has cleared enough for me to see it accurately, maybe for the first time. Not cruelly, not with a need to punish, but clearly. They are people who love me in the way they understand love, and that understanding has limits I can no longer pretend aren't there. Those limits nearly cost me everything on a January Saturday when the ceiling was tilting and I needed someone to say, "Go, just go." Becca said go. Becca always says go. Arthur Bellamy, a retired civil engineer from Sheboygan whose wife was recovering on the 4th floor, said go in his own way. He didn't know me. He had no obligation to me. He looked at a situation from 20 feet away and decided that what he was seeing wasn't acceptable. And then he did something about it, and then he didn't tell me about it so I could thank him. That is a specific kind of decency that I don't have a word for, but I recognize it when I see it, because I had spent a long time looking for it in places that couldn't give it. The succulent is on my windowsill. It's doing fine, so am I.